Here in Europe, 10% of population don't have bank accounts. If you don't have a bank account, it is really shaming to say that. In my country, 90% of people live in poverty, 50% in extreme poverty. Venezuela being at the center of some geopolitical battle, or eventually even a military battle, is the responsibility of Maduro. If we had democratic elections, if we had a normal system, we will not be in this situation. We will have a normal country. You try to open a bank account and you cannot. You try to rent an apartment, therefore you cannot, because you don't have a bank account. So then you cannot get a job either, because which job is gonna hire you without a bank account or without an apartment? So then you are pushed, your only solution, your only way to survive is to then do black market operations. A lot of institutions have labeled Maduro and have accused Maduro and have confirmed Maduro as having this connection with drug dealing.
Moving Europe, episode 16, today with Jorge Jraissati. You are president of the Economic Inclusion Group.
Yes.
Here in Brussels, and you are as well been an opponent of the Maduro government in Venezuela.
Yep.
To start, first of all, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks to you.
Yeah. And what is the link between these two things? Between your work on economic inclusion, your opposition against Maduro?
I mean, for many years, I have been focusing on the Maduro regime thing and trying to make changes there. But then I realized that many of the problems that we see in Venezuela are problems that happen in other countries to a different degree. And I will put two examples of the things that I really work on. One is the financial exclusion issue, which at the beginning I was tackling it from the Venezuelan perspective, because we have had banking crisis, monetary crisis, hyperinflation, all these issues. And as a result, most people in my country don't have bank accounts. They don't have access to financial services. But then I started to realize that in other places, this trend is also happening. For example, here in Europe, 10% of population don't have bank accounts. 10%. And many people in our sector, like nonprofits, people in policy, small business people, they are losing their access to banking services in Europe, which is something that most people just don't realize. But it's because of the unintended consequences of bad regulation. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that in Venezuela, the dictatorship was established in part because people were really dissatisfied by the way democracy was working before. People felt that the economy was too harsh, that the economy was not working for them. And because of that, they voted for more radical solutions. And I think that those lessons can also be and should also be communicated in democracies. So that way what happened in Venezuela is not repeated in other places. So that's the connection. I run the Economic Inclusion Group, and within the organization we have a specific Venezuela unit that we call Victoria Venezuela. So I do that, and I do also international stuff in Washington and here in Brussels.
And how come Victoria Venezuela?
Victoria Venezuela.
Yeah, but how come the name, specifically Victoria?
Because we want victory. We want change. Yeah, so that's kind of the meaning behind it, because I think that we need to actually, Venezuela for many years, we have been such a society used to bad news all the time. We are a society used to hopelessness, a society used of every single day, more humanitarian crisis, more political issues. And I really think that we need to find a way to bring back the spirit, the good vibes of the people. So that was partially why me and my friends, we chose that name.
You grew up in Venezuela, and then eventually you moved to the US for your studies. And if we understood correctly, it's there that you really started more with the political activism as well. Was there any particular reason or any particular moment that sparked this political side in you?
Yes, it's partially correct, because I have always been politically sparked. Since I'm 15 years old, I have been involved in some sense with activism. At the beginning through social media, and then with high school kind of activism. and eventually university. But I moved to the US in 2015 to the university because in 2014 there was big protests in Venezuela, and I was part of these protests just as a regular activist, and I saw how many people were put in jail. I saw how many people were repressed by the government. So that's why I decided to go to the US to study economics, actually, like you guys. But when I was in the US, I remember thinking, I cannot just be here. I need to find ways to contribute. So in 2017, there was big protest in Venezuela that lasted 4 or 5 months in a row. And I remember that I decided as my contribution to raise awareness in the US about these protests. And at the time, there was not much understanding about Venezuela. Now it's way more mainstream, but at the time it was not. So I started raising awareness in universities. I spoke at many college campuses. I started speaking on media, writing articles. I was 20, 21 at the time, and that's when I really became more active. I grew my following to now I have 100,000 followers on Twitter, so I became more and more active. Yes.
Oh wow, we need to learn.
I will give you some tips.
Thank you.
And how was the beginning of trying to raise awareness? I mean, I guess also for you, it must have been quite a big step, no, to put your face out there, to go around campuses, to talk about what you believe in. How was it in the beginning?
At the beginning, I remember my expectations was that nobody would care about Venezuela. I remember when I was talking to people, that was my expectation. But the reality was very different. People really start caring about it. Young people, when they see injustice everywhere, I believe that they feel empathetic about the situation. I think young people are really passionate. It's one of the best things about being young, is that you really care when you see an injustice. And I remember start talking about it, and people start noticing, people start paying attention. The first thing that I did is that I started going to universities in the US. So local groups at each university start inviting me to speak. And I did that again, like I went to Maryland, I went to Stanford, I went to Minnesota, New York. I was traveling, and I was only 20. I was self-financing most of my things. And I did that, and I saw that people were reacting to it, and more Venezuela became mainstream. Then I graduated from university in 2019, I believe, December, and I took the interesting decision of coming back to Venezuela. So I actually came back to Venezuela to do research on sanctions evasion and to do research on the humanitarian crisis of Venezuela. And I published a big media in the US, in National Review magazine, Foreign Policy magazine, National Interest, to again raise more awareness. So that was my beginning in this field of work.
And a tough choice. How come you did? Because you felt that you wanted to give your contribution there concretely on in Venezuela after the experience in the US.
I had 4 years without going to Venezuela. So for me, it was really important to understand and to see live what I was writing about, I was talking about, and I was really commenting. Because when you spend 4 years or any kind of years outside a country, you can lose track of what people really feel. Because you can read in Twitter, you can read over the news, but it's not the same. Because in my country, the overwhelming majority don't have Twitter, they don't have Wi-Fi, they are not in media. So you really need to go there to see what people are feeling. My thinking was to go there for a few months, but then the pandemic happened. So I got stuck basically of a year and a half I spent in Venezuela. And I remember, okay, let's analyze the humanitarian crisis. So I publish articles about the humanitarian crisis and research. Let's talk to people and let's publish what's going on. So I published about how the pandemic was being weaponized. I wrote about what people were feeling at the time. I wrote about what young people were feeling at the time. I really took it as an intellectual exercise to understand my country better. And then after I published these articles about sanctions evasion, I realized that it was better for me to not be inside, to be outside, so I could do more work and I could actually communicate better these ideas.
And this was what I was gonna ask. In this time where you were in the country publishing, about also sensitive political topics, was there ever concern from your side or fear from political repercussions, or not really?
I mean, like as everything, we need to take care of ourselves, and we need to have measures for everything. I'm very well prepared in all regards in terms of that, because I have very good people who have advised me about things. So, I mean, like the only thing that I received at the time was that my name was in many newspapers, was in many media. There was some sort of negative media or negative push, but that was pretty much it. I'm also, my profile, I guess, is not big enough to do it. And I always treat everything very seriously. Everything I say is very well documented. Everything that I say is very well researched. And I really want to contribute. I'm not there to get clicks or to get likes. In fact, if I wanted to, I will be doing other stuff. I really want to find solutions for the country, and I have this intention. So everything I do has a specific purpose, and it has a long-term view in mind, not some sort of trying to get attention on me.
And right now that you're outside of Venezuela, do you feel that you can still contribute to developments there, or does it get harder with geographical distance?
In some sense, I can contribute even more being outside. Because being outside, I'm able to not only raise awareness, but to shape policy and shape the way policy is being done on Venezuela. As you know, if you have good connections and good engagement with institutions like the European Commission, like the European Parliament, like the Council of Europe, I would say also in the US, like the State Department or like the Treasury Department, you are really able to shape the capacities and the policies that these institutions have on Venezuela. And if I'm able to do that, and if I'm able to develop that expertise, I can contribute way more than if I'm inside the country. I think it's a very particular situation. It's a very difficult situation. And I think the only thing that I really emphasize is that I really need to continue being on touch and talking with the people on the ground. Because if you start only talking to the people who are around you, who are also working on policy, or who are working on international finance, you really lose track of what 90% of the people really believe.
Yeah,
in my country,
it's a bit of a bubble also then, no?
It becomes a bubble, because in my country, 90% of people live in poverty, 50% in extreme poverty. So the type of conversations, the type of aspirations, challenges that they have, if I don't proactively talk to them, then you end up becoming
difficult
isolated.
to grasp, of course, yeah.
You become isolated.
Yeah, and also because there I think you have different also interest, like the interest of the European Commission or, for example, of US state is more maybe political, strategic, while, for example, the interest of Venezuela citizens, like it's something very different, I think it gives you a cool perspective, How do you balance these two? Like to see, for example, sometimes strategic political decisions that are so far from what the Venezuela citizens really look for,
I think the job of anybody working in policy, and especially international policy, or the job of an ambassador or a foreign minister, is to find where are the commonalities and where are the positive reinforcement of what your people want and what these international institutions want. And in the case of Venezuela, what I see is that the interests of the Venezuelan people can be put inside the context of what international policymakers want. For example, there is a lot of empathy in members of parliament about the Venezuelan situation. I really believe that they understand the gravity of the problem. I really think that because many Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese moved to Venezuela back in the day, and now so many Venezuelans are also in Europe, you have this connection that makes people way more empathic. Because we are a Western society in Venezuela, we are a Western country. So because of this, I really think that you can find win-win situations. It's tricky at the same time, because geopolitical interests are usually, countries, they don't have friends, they have joint interests. Yeah. So you need to...
How is it that concretely, to manage to stay in touch with the people there? Because I imagine that, of course, I think it's a great ideal to have, but I can imagine that on the ground it's not that easy from abroad to stay, to hear what people think.
It's extremely, extremely harsh for many reasons. First of all, you naturally lose touch. You naturally lose touch with the way people see the world. You start hanging out more and more with a certain kind of people, and you don't have this natural connection that you would have if you were in Venezuela. If I'm in Venezuela, I will go to a coffee shop, I will go to a supermarket, I will go to church, and everybody you are talking to people. Outside is way more difficult. So the thing I try to do is that I call many people, I text many people, and I try to listen more than I speak about it. And people that I know that we are friends for many years before I became involved in policy, people that have nothing to do with politics, I try to keep up with them. So that's the way I keep some sort of bridge with people.
It's like us trying to stay
Yeah.
in touch with our Italian.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think this really gives you also an added value, no? Like when dealing with Venezuela. Do you think that, for example, people dealing with the country, they have this approach that you have as well? Or is mainly or on one side or on the other? Like to have this mix?
You mean like people working on Venezuelan issues?
Exactly. Like if you see people just focusing on geopolitics, people just focusing on Venezuelan citizens, or you have many like you that try
I think
to do
that there
both?
is, among the Venezuelan, let's say, people who are politically active in Venezuela, I believe that most have a very good grasp of Venezuelan people. I really think that what could be lacking, and it's a natural thing, is people who also understand the other side, who is how international institutions work, how advocacy works, how international in financial issues, for example. People who know about politics and know about finance, it's very difficult to find people who understand both. So for me, it's really interesting because when I'm talking with people who only understand about finance and about banking, then it gives me a different way of see the issues as well, because I have this other perspective. I think most people in the Venezuelan leadership or the opposition, for example, are really connected to what people in the country want. I think that they do that really well. So I think the challenge would be how you also connect with the international community.
And can you give, like, to the audience an example, for example, of where you have been particularly successful in not doing advocacy that mix strategic interests, for example, favorable to state and the Venezuelan citizen prosperity, if you have something in your mind?
Yes. I mean, for example, I have done a lot of work when it comes to in banking regulation. I know this is not a technical show, so
No, it's okay. So far, it's not technical.
right. But for example, I have achieved, let's say, in the Council of Europe, the introduction of a few resolutions that make the financial inclusion of Venezuelans in Europe better. So I have improved a specific set of regulations called anti-money laundering rules. I have been working on that because something that is happening is that many people are losing their bank accounts in Europe. Many of them are immigrants, so many of them are Venezuelans. So then these people, when they want to work, they're actually pushed towards dependency because they cannot even open a bank account. So because I have very good knowledge on banking, I have been able to move that forward with the intention of making the European economy more competitive, more inclusive, more prosperous, etc. But at the same time, it helps the Venezuelan people. So that's, I would say, an interesting example.
I imagine because like 10% is a striking figures of people excluded from financial services. So do you think in the European Union we have a systemic issue?
Yes. It's a systemic and it's a growing problem.
Growing problem.
Yes. And people are just not paying enough attention because it's an issue that is a taboo problem. If you don't have a bank account, it is really shaming to say that. Imagine if you are if you are an immigrant, you are really ashamed to say something like that. But even if you are owner of a non-profit, or if you have a small business, anything, is very stigma issue. 10% of Europeans don't have a bank account. According to the European Banking Authority, bank de-risking, which is the terminology of when you lose your bank account, is one of the three biggest problems in Europeans' financial sector. It's a big issue. Many non-profits and humanitarian organizations are losing their access to financial services. In Europe, here, many in Brussels, big foundations that have $10 million in budget, $20 million in budget, are losing their banking access. It's just that it's such a niche problem, not a niche, a stigma, technical issue that nobody wants to speak about it. So I think it's a growing problem because in Europe they have all these anti-money laundering regulations, which are just extremely difficult to implement. They're not done in a cost-benefit analysis way. They're growing, putting more and more pressure into what they call risky types of customers, which again, if you're a humanitarian organization sending aid to Ukraine, you are a risky customer. Yeah. If you are doing trade with Latin America, especially with countries like Colombia or Panama, you are a risky customer. If you are sending aid to Middle East, risky customer. Energy, defense, etc. That's anti-money laundering rules and some ESG rules as well, which is interesting.
Can you maybe for the audience explain in very basic terms why people either don't have access to banking or lose their access? What are the main reasons for this?
People and organizations in Europe are losing their access to bank accounts because of the way financial regulation is mislabeled them as too risky. So financial regulation is putting too much compliance cost to banks, but I know it's very difficult for people who are not technical to understand.
But too risky from a financial perspective or also from a political perspective?
From anti-money laundering perspective. So that's why I'm trying to explain this in an easy way, right? Right? But bank regulation are placing people or are mislabeling people as too risky when it comes to anti-money laundering rules. So what banks are doing is that instead of mitigating those risks or to engaging with every client, they are just shutting down entire group of customers. And they don't want the cost-benefit analysis. Is that the benefit of having a non-profit is extremely low and the cost and the risk is extremely high. Because if regulators think that your level of risk as a bank is too high, you can get fines, you can get enormous cost and compliance issues. So that's kind of the problem that is happening.
And I think here to explain is that basically you apply a score to the risk, no? That is based on very objective and standard criteria. For example, if you are dealing with Russia, for example, you are an NGO that opposed to the Putin regime, according to the anti-money laundering criteria, you see, okay, this is a transaction that is involved with Russia Federation, that is high-risk jurisdiction. So in the criteria, you give as high risk, even if in the end it's not high risk, because it's politically aligned. That's a bit what's happening, I imagine.
Yes, exactly. And what banks decided to do is that they try to eliminate risk. So then not only happens if you're an opposition member against Putin in Russia, but then also happens if you are Russian, and that's it. Yeah. Or also happens in the past you made deals with Russia. But the same happens with if you are a defense company. So many defense companies are having issues either with banking access or with credit access because of anti-money laundering laws and because of ESG regulation. Because ESG, the problem is that many of these guidelines are subjective and are very vague and are very broad. And banks, they just want to eliminate any kind of risk. So what they do is that, for example, if you are a foundation and the foundation is sending money to activists in Belarus and banks see this transaction, they will freeze the transaction. And if they see that this foundation is just too costly or too risky because they could be in sanctions problem, anti-money laundering issues, etc., the bank will say, I just better shut down their account. So when banks' accounts are shut down, then this organization just receives a letter saying that they have X amount of days to move the money somewhere. But it's very difficult because when one bank shuts you down, it's very difficult to open other ones, especially for this profile. So there's a shilling effect. And this happens to Also with, for example, if you're a non-profit, or if you're a politically exposed people, by the way. I know many diplomats that after they're diplomats, they are politically exposed person, and because of this, it's very difficult for them to be in boards of companies or to have bank accounts, etc.
And do you think that the state of the current regulations in Europe, they are too strict, that this is a consequence, or what do you think would be the solution to avoid these kind of situations?
The problem with anti-money laundering rules in Europe is that they are done without cost-benefit analysis. So they're putting more and more regulation without understanding if they're being effective or if they're having unintended consequences. So the rules in Europe, they grow in ways that they don't make it more effective. The problem is that the rules are extremely vague and subjective and broad. So for example, if anti-money laundering laws were more clear, for instance, if a company is not only accused but is convicted of a crime, shut down their account. That we can all agree. But the problem is that everything is subjective. So if they think they could, they might, then the accounts are shut down. That's the problem. And in Europe, they put last year this new anti-money laundering package, and they create something called anti-money laundering authority, which makes things even worse because makes it even more complex. Because then not only you have these national regulators, you now have these EU regulators, and banks have to follow all these guidelines. So an activist, an immigrant, a non-profit, a small business, it will simply be not, it will not be profitable for banks to have.
And it's true that then banks, they are, in brackets, scared in the sense that for them, even the slight risk of reputational damage is so big that they say, okay, we shut down. Even if it's an activist.
Imagine that, I don't know, imagine that in a few years, your podcast is way bigger. And then you have competitors who are attacking you. And they start attacking you by saying that you receive funding from a Russian oligarch. Then when you try to open an account or to keep an account, this information will appear in your profile. And then the bank will need to make a decision. These guys bring me this amount of money per year. These guys bring me this amount of cost, compliance risk, reputational risk. What is the cost? What is the benefit? And in many cases, the benefit is to shut you down.
Are you trying to lobby also the European institutions in this sense?
We're doing advocacy in European institutions, and we have many members of parliament who are really interested on this issue. So this is something that we have been doing, very effective. We did the first ever event in the European Parliament on this issue. We did it in September. We have put together motions for resolution in the Council of Europe that have the support of 60 members of parliament on these type of issues. And so we are doing stuff. We need to do more. And I think we have everything so that next year we do even more. It's a bit difficult because it's a very technical issue. Yeah. So something that I'm also working on is how to explain these issues in a much more intuitive way. Because not only you need to have an advocacy strategy, you also need to have a public awareness strategy.
And because I also think in this regard is because money laundering is such an important issue if you look at the number, at the scale of the problem, no? Like how much is also of illegal economic money enter into the EU economy or in the Western economy. I think the numbers are crazy. Do you think there is awareness of this, first of all, among the general public, like of how much flows of illegal money enter into the legal economy every day?
I think that there is some sort of understanding, but how many people are passionate about this issue?
Just me.
Exactly. Just a few people, right?
That's true.
And something that I always say is that I'm not trying to dismantle anti-money laundering laws. I'm trying to make them better. Yeah. I want to make them more efficient. Yeah. If you push people outside the financial system, it's not good for their financial inclusion, it's not good for economic development, but it's also not good for financial integrity purposes. And if you have all these inefficient measures, then you will never catch the people that are really doing money laundering. So for example, I don't know a statistic about Europe, but in the US, banks every year, they have to 5 million suspicious activity reports and 20 million transaction reports. Those are extra compliance measures that then are sent to law enforcement agents. But that means then that you are sending all this low value quantity of information. That really means that the real information will be lost in all this low value data.
And I'm curious more from the politics side of things. Are there any, other groups or organizations which oppose what you stand for, or which try to put obstacles in your way?
Yes. First of all, I think we are the only organization that really understands this issue to this magnitude. In other areas, you have way more of a push. For example, in free speech or in free trade, or even when I'm speaking about Venezuela, I have many other organizations doing interesting work. But when it comes to this issue, I would say, inefficiency of anti-money laundering laws, we are the only ones. We are the only ones working systematically on this. On those who are opposing, I think that is all the financial crime establishment. They see this issue in a different way than the way I see it. They have told me, to my face, Jorge, I don't care if 10 people lose their bank accounts. Doesn't matter that, because we want to catch the criminals. And they maybe have good intentions, but the reality is that you cannot build a society that way. Because imagine if you have policemen thinking like that. We're going to kill, they say that they're going to kill people just to arrest one. It's just not the way society works. And at the same time, what I'm telling them is that if you improve these regulations, you also improve the financial integrity aspect. I see this issue as an economist, and I see this issue as a person who cares about policy. Usually the people who craft and who write these regulations, they see it from the perspective of law enforcement. So that's the push that we have. One of the problems with this issue is that for many people, they just don't feel empathetic enough. Because this is, not, of course, not an issue that a normal professional will face. An engineer working in Paris, an architect working in Rome. No, this is an issue that affects either very poor people, very marginalized people, or affects people doing international business or defense or energy. So it's very particular. So because of that there is not like a wide, and what does, a CEO of an energy company and a migrant have in common? Not much. So because of that, then it's very difficult to also have some sort of united front.
And do you think that, do you know if for citizens from Venezuela who live in Europe, in the EU, are those systematically classified by banks as too risky to open bank accounts? Is this a systematic issue for Venezuelans?
Yes. It's not a systematic issue in the sense that not all of them lose their bank accounts. But it's a systematic issue that the banks classify anybody coming from these jurisdictions as high-risk individuals, especially if you do business with these jurisdictions. So if you have a company doing business not only with Venezuela, but other Latin American countries.
And this is mainly linked to the fact that the EU is today applying some sanctions to Venezuela, or is it more about the general propensity of or assessment of risk coming from that jurisdiction in relation to anti-money laundering?
That's a very good question, because that's the issue, is that because all these regulations and guidelines are very broad, then banks need to take information from different places. So banks use the Financial Action Task Force list, which is they do something called the gray list, the black list. So Venezuela is gray listed. But at the same time, Venezuela is gray listed the same way that until a few months ago, Croatia was gray listed. Or right now, Monaco is gray listed. So it's really very different, like compare Croatia with Burkina Faso or Venezuela. They also use the EU list of high-risk jurisdictions. They have a list, but at the same time, there is many sanctions. There is OFAC in the US. But at the same time, there is anything that can be considered a humanitarian crisis or a conflict zone. I think that in 10 years, banks will be subject to so much compliance cost that everything will be high risk, and banking will be a privilege of only a few people. It will be a privilege of only a few jurisdictions and a few professional work. You need to be, anybody who is related to politics will be on bank. Anybody who works on defense will be on bank. Anybody doing business with Africa or Latin America will be on bank. And this will, of course, put Europe and also the US at such a disadvantage. Because then if you're a company and you're trying to exploit minerals from Bolivia or Peru, you're trying to extract rare earth minerals, then good luck trying to get credit from a bank in Europe. It will be almost impossible to do so. So you will need to go to a Chinese bank. You will need to do partnership with a Chinese company. And that's why then Europe will not be able to fulfill either its defense budget or this energy autonomy that they want to build.
It's extremely interesting because it's in the end of the day a balancing act between, legitimate concerns with money laundering, and on the other hand, avoiding that it becomes a competitive disadvantage also for the banking sector, and of course that it doesn't have negative social impacts on the citizens. So it's a very complicated balance to strike.
I find it fascinating because, for example, on this energy thing, Europe right now imports like all its critical minerals come from either China or Chinese-owned companies in, let's say, Congo. So from that perspective, then you don't have any kind of autonomy. But then if you want to build this production line with Latin America, you will have all this excessive compliance cost that will make it extremely difficult for you. The same with defense. You want to have a strong defense in Europe, but regulations are making banks disinvest in anything that is not ESG or in anything that is not complying with anti-money laundering rules.
And here, do you have like experience or knowledge of for example, the Chinese system in terms of anti-money laundering? Did you have like the opportunity to study how much is easier to get access, for example, for our Chinese banks from jurisdiction across the world in relation to the EU?
I need to do more actually. So I know the basics, but I haven't done the proper research. From what I have talked to people, I'm pretty sure that these systems are heavily like politicized. So the state is like the enforcement of these rules. The state will be able to do a lot of exceptions if you're a company who is doing something the state likes to do. But of course, I don't have the real data to show you.
Because it will be super interesting, like to see the impact on your competitiveness, but also on your economic growth of this current way of system of anti-money laundering. I know you're an economist, like can you, I mean, it's difficult like to do an estimate, like competing is difficult, but like GDP growth, for example, like how many billions of...
I would love to do like a more formal analysis.
I think
nobody has done
super interesting.
So nobody has done it. This is something I have talked to people in the parliament, in the economics committee to do a report on this. I have talked to people in the treasury in the US to do a report on this because nobody has done it. Like nobody has said anti-money laundering rules are costing this amount of money per year.
Because
like grow.
Yeah, because I think there is like usually is a bit the figure that is a bit like the touch. To translate this into a concrete figure of how many competitiveness GDP growth we are losing, it will be like, I think, maybe a possible game changer for policymakers.
Or how many people are, because we have this 10% number, but it will be really good to know is how many people per year are losing their bank accounts because of bad anti-money laundering rules. We just don't have this data.
And for you, in your day-to-day, you work with the economic inclusion group. So you already said you do some advocacy with the different institutions. Are you, to which degree are you also, in touch directly with the banking sector to get some data from them, some information for them? And on the other hand, how much are you directly in touch or try to be, a go-to institution for people who lose bank accounts? So just to understand a bit your stakeholders.
Exactly. By the way, we have very close connections, I would say, with banking and with crypto assets, with both Bitcoin and stable coins, because I really want to understand their position as well. I want to understand the challenges they're facing. So very good relationship with them. With the people who have been victims of financial exclusion, we are building a database. So we have many cases. Many are internal. Many we want to make public. Actually, that's one of the goals that we have for next year, which is to have some sort of landing page where people can go and they can see maybe an interactive map and they can click Spain and they can see like how many cases we have or which type of cases we have, right? because we need to make this more appealing for people to understand. So and eventually we want a place where people can feel safe enough to share the stories. We have not kind of in masses get these cases, because I think that many people are just afraid to talk about it.
Yeah. But potentially, if indeed there are 10% of EU citizens without a banking account, your interested people could be a huge amount. So it's, I guess, just a challenge of reaching them and convincing them to also share this story.
Exactly. To share the story, to share how was the experience, how they solved the experience. For me, it has been fascinating. Just when companies, when they tell me, Jorge, we lost our bank account, and most companies, they don't know anything about this. So the experience is they wake up one day and they see that their bank accounts are frozen and they need to find a solution. So for me, it has been interesting when they tell me how they solve the problem. Many of them solve the problem through Bitcoin, which to me was fascinating to read and to see and to understand. So I know organizations who have sent humanitarian aid through Bitcoin, or others that solve with stable coins. So for me, it has been really interesting to understand this. Yeah, you know who was the bank? Christine Lagarde.
Oh, really?
How come?
So you see, so it's very funny. Because last week I was with a couple of members of parliament who are with me working on these issues. One of them is from Croatia, Bartulica, his last name. And we're talking before Lagarde came to the parliament. We're talking about questions that he could ask Lagarde about debanking. Mm-hmm. He asked these questions to her. And the way she replied is that she said, well, I was debanked. She said,
so crazy. How?
Yes.
But the reason why, you don't know.
The reason, again, I'm just speculating because I don't know anything about the case. But the reason is that because she's a politically exposed person. She's a person that is involved in politics, and as a result, she has higher compliance costs. That is very risky for banks. And I think there will be a point in which banks push away anybody who is involved in politics because it will be too risky. Yeah. And this same comment I have received from former prime ministers, former diplomats, a lot of people. They just don't want to make it public because of the stigma.
Yeah. And I think it's super interesting. Also, the point that you mentioned on moving through stable coins, Bitcoin, is a consequence. And in the end, you move to a channel of flow of money that is not regulated, basically, it was poorly regulated, which then can have a very negative impact on laundering, like on tackling money laundering, no? And here, just one question. So, because of course you mentioned this example of financially excluded people based on this criteria, but the people that want to be targeted, do you think they are being effective in circumventing then the EU money laundering? Just, are we penalizing people that do not need to be penalized, while we are not able to catch the ones that we want to penalize?
Of course, because laundering money is not stopped with these measures that catch people who have a small non-profits or who are politically exposed people. If somebody who is laundering millions of dollars, they can hire lawyers, they can hire, many of them, they're owners of financial institutions. So if you're laundering money from, I don't know, let's say you're laundering money from an African country, you are probably friends of the government. So you probably own or have friends who own banks themselves. So really all these things, all these rules don't block this type of transactions.
Because in the end, you move through stablecoin, Bitcoin, for example, and if you know that your jurisdiction is high risk, you don't do the transaction through the high risk jurisdiction if you have the means, no?
Yes.
Maybe you do a transaction through a jurisdiction that is not high risk.
And again, most money laundering goes in partnership with governments who are, for example, authoritarian governments, etc. So I really think that they don't even need to move to stablecoin, anything like that, because they have their own financial institutions to move money on.
So can you give maybe an example just for people who maybe don't know so much how this works? If there's, let's say, state-sponsored money laundering, right, of some authoritarian regimes, how would authoritarian state go about this? How would they set it up?
I mean, of course, I cannot, I don't know, I don't know the specifics, right? I don't know the onboarding process, but For example, like if you're an authoritarian state and you want to do money laundering, then these states, they have their own instruments as a state. You have a central bank. You have your own network of banks. You probably have friends with banks in many countries. You probably yourself have hundreds of millions of dollars in banks in specific countries. So when you have this level of money and wealth, this type of rules don't apply to you because it's like another league of people. Sadly, that's very unfortunate, but that's the reality of it. So these anti-money laundering rules have been extremely ineffective because they do it in ways that you're not tackling the source of the problem, which is that money laundering goes through and in partnership with states.
But it's not still too early to say if the rules have been effective because they're quite new, no? So,
I mean, like they have been growing. Okay, so they have been really growing since 9/11. So these rules actually in the 2000s became exploding and became even more since the 2010s. The problem is that I don't see any indications that they're being effective. Like I see no indication of them being effective, and I see no indication of a serious attempt of making them effective.
Yeah, but how can you measure if they are effective? Like then you measure, I don't know, the number of seizure of... That's like the criteria, like to see, okay, they're being effective because we tackle these criminal networks, okay?
Yes, and I will do, for example, okay, they will say, for example, we seize $100 billion with anti-money laundering rules. And they need to check, out of that, how many was through these specific guidelines, or how many was through that. The same way that you will check other things. Like, for example, if you have the traffic, you want to control the traffic and you want to control traffic accidents, then you will see, okay, this highway is not, there's too many traffic accidents in this highway. Why? Okay, in this and this intersection. So we will put a police person in that intersection maybe. But the way anti-money laundering laws now are working is that you have a highway and you want to put policemen in every 10 meters of the highway. And where, when the real people doing money laundering, they take helicopters and they're just going up. So
that's a good metaphor. Yeah. Like, if, for example, we free Venezuela from oil sanctions, the Venezuelan oil, for example, in terms of quality and also price, if the EU becomes again a client and replace Russian oil with Venezuelan oil instead of oil from other jurisdictions, do you think there will be an economic advantage for the EU? Will this oil be cheaper?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course, because Venezuela will bring, in a period of 15 years, it will bring at least 2.5 or 3 million barrels more to the market. That's considerable. And Venezuela produces extra heavy oil, which is a very particular way of oil. And Venezuela will be an ally, so that way you don't need to rely on all these autocratic nations for oil. And Venezuela is not only oil, it has massive refinery capacity. It has massive natural gas, gold capacity. So from that perspective, I believe that Venezuela could be an energy hub in the region that could really stabilize energy markets, and it could really offer diversified energy routes to Europe and to America. So that's why I really think that that's also partially the reason why the international community focuses so much on Venezuela, because I think they understand the strategic aspect of it.
Yes, because also the EU, in terms of purchasing now gas and replacing the Russian gas, like also it purchases from the US, the liquefied, which is 4 times more expensive than the Russian gas was at the time. So for example, Venezuelan gas, it will be not that more expensive.
Exactly. Okay. That's partially it. The other reason is that EU has this level of unused capital. It has this currency surplus. It has so much money that doesn't know where to go. And Venezuela is a totally destroyed country that will need investment in all areas. Like Venezuela's GDP declined in 12 years by over 75%. So we lost 70% of our economy. In Venezuela, all areas are destroyed. Energy, infrastructure, tourism, pretty much everything will need investment. So we will need $1 trillion on investment. So that's capital that will benefit European and American companies. Because right now Venezuela is being the only investment going on in Venezuela is Iran and China.
And what do you think would need to happen to make this economic development possible? Is it possible still under the current regime of Maduro, or not really?
I don't believe so, honestly, because Maduro has shown an unwillingness to accept basic economic and political freedoms and political rights in the country. And in that context, the country will not be a peaceful country. And it will not be a market economy. It will not be a democracy. So it will not have the trust of foreign investors. It will be under sanctions because of this. So Maduro brought this level of uncertainty and instability to Venezuela that brought all this mess to Venezuela. All this good scenario, all these good hypotheses of change can only happen if we have a change in government, from my perspective.
And how likely is it that such a change of government can happen anytime soon?
We don't know. We don't know. There is a lot of things being said, a lot of things being done, but it will be more like, we don't know, honestly.
Yeah, and here an extremely interesting point that I would like to understand is that, like, sanctions regime. Now you said like Venezuela is under heavy sanction, impacted all the sectors of the economy. You have like 50% of Venezuela in extreme poverty. You mentioned, like, so the impact on the population of sanction is huge, but the impact on the capacity to change the Venezuelan regime. What do you make out of it? Like, also in history, like, have sanctions really been effective in making a regime fall, or they just strengthen it?
No. First let's begin by the humanitarian crisis. Most of the humanitarian crisis is the result of domestic policy. So sanctions have a say. They indeed exacerbated some aspects of the Venezuelan economy. But I would say that 90%, 80% of the economic crisis is by domestic policymaking. The Venezuelan government, first Hugo Chavez and then Maduro, they implemented all possible bad economic policies. They nationalized industry, they put price controls, they did hyperinflation, they put currency controls, they put production quotas, a lot of bad policies. However, with that being said, the sanctions, the way they're implemented, from my experience and from historical experience, is that they don't produce what they say they will produce. In some cases, they say that they will produce regime change. It never happens. Because sanctions by themselves, they just debilitate the state income. But that doesn't mean that it will be a regime change as a result. They have, I think, a flawed theory of change. I think many policymakers, they think that... Yep.
No, I think it's interesting because the sanctions are a core tool of foreign policy today, you know, like both of the EU, of the US. And even though the results they have often promised have not really arrived. So it's curious. So I'm wondering if it's also a question of internal political signaling, you know, saying, look, I'm doing something about a situation. This is what I'm doing, regardless of what precise effects then it may or may not have. I mean, I think it's clear that sanctions do have some impact, but of course, regime changes maybe not necessarily one of them.
I think that it is, for some people, sanctions is a signaling mechanism, as you mentioned. For others, is that they are genuinely concerned about a country situation, and they think that by sanctioning a regime, they are doing something that is morally correct, that they're punishing the bad guys, that they are punishing the Maduro regime, or that they're punishing their oligarchs, etc. And the reality is that sanctions should be seen in such way more sophisticated way, in which sanctions have to be part of a policy toolbox, in which if they're applied in a specific set of conditions, in combination with other set of conditions, they can achieve something. They should not be seen in this ideological or dogmatic way. I think too much time they're seen in a very dogmatic way, without really measuring. I really believe in measuring policy. You really need to measure what they do. And of course, it's very basic, but many times it's just something that is not done enough. So in the case of Venezuela, they thought that sanctions will debilitate the regime, and that because of this, they will foment some sort of change in the country. But the problem is that change is way more complex than that. So if you only debilitate the government, okay, maybe you can do that. And the other issue with sanctions is that you can implement all the sanctions in the world, but if you don't have enforcement of sanctions, then the sanctions become a PR thing. They become a PR issue, and they're really not enforceable. So I'm really not dogmatic with sanctions. Sometimes they can be used, sometimes they should not be used. I think we are overusing sanctions. That's my overall thinking. We're maybe overusing them. And it becomes a PR thing.
And sanctions, of course, it's an important tool. I said before also for the EU, but I think in what I'm curious about is for Venezuela in particular, how their relations are with their closer neighbors, also in Latin America. Do you know something about this? How other countries treat them, which are not, let's say, such superpowers? And not to say that the EU is a superpower, but it's a big bloc.
I mean, the EU is big. So the EU is 450 million people. The European Economic Area is like the second largest economy in the world. It's an economic power, it's a diplomatic power, all the above. With the neighbors in the region, most neighbors are really, I think, tired of the situation in Venezuela. Nobody likes a situation in which you have a massive country with a massive humanitarian crisis, with a massive failed state situation. So most neighbors, I think they just want a change in Venezuela. I think doesn't matter if you are social democrat, conservative, socialist. I think nobody wants to see the situation in the country. Because I really think that the Venezuela situation goes beyond left and right. It goes beyond if you're progressive or not. It is really a situation of a devastated country, a failed state. It's a country that is not respecting democratic norms. And it's a country that is developing all these, I would say, bad policies against the people.
But the other countries, they don't apply, for instance, trade restrictions to Venezuela, like the immediate neighbors, or do they?
No, there is some restrictions going on, but it's not it's not a thing as much, yeah. But at the same time, you have U.S. sanctions. So there is some negative effect there.
Yeah, and I also think that the problem when designing sanctions as well is that you look at them from a democratic perspective, because our democratic states that usually put into place sanctions, because they said, okay, if we hurt, for example, the Venezuelan economy, this can have a chilling effect on the government. But in the end is that people usually in authoritarian regime, they do not have a say. So even if inflation, you have an impact on inflation, you have an impact on domestic consumption, in the end, these people didn't vote before and don't have a say even so they are worse off, but they can need.
You are totally correct. I really believe that many people in democracies, they see sanctions from the blueprint of a democracy, but they're dealing with autocracy. So if you put sanctions to a democratic country and the economy goes to the toilet, people will then vote for another person in the election. But in autocracies, you don't have election. So many policymakers have this belief, or what I call the French Revolution belief, in which they think that people will just go to the street and they will go, the masses will go, and they think that the masses will somehow go and topple the regime. It never happens. Because when the people try to do that, they're shot.
Yeah. And then it creates the effect, as the question I did to you before, I was saying, the impact of sanctions that people believe, and also inside the country, that is not because domestic policy were really bad, but because of sanctions. So they also have an enemy to indicate instead of themselves for people not being well.
That's true. Also, that is true also. And so it's really not sanctions. I think they can be used. They should be used with a specific conditions, a specific circumstance.
Yeah, and they're talking about Venezuela. What do you make of the current situation with the U.S.? The impact, for example, of now these U.S. unprecedented strikes on narcotraffic and those kind of things. what do you see is the US approach there? Like, where is the real interest? Are we really going to fight narcotraffic? Is really more geopolitical interest? Is it both?
Both. I think it's geopolitical and it's drug trafficking. Drug trafficking is indeed a problem, and it has become a problem increasingly in Venezuela. And we used to not have this issue, but now we do. It's a geopolitical thing at the same time. For me, it's very unfortunate because the situation of having Venezuela being at the center of some geopolitical battle or eventually even a military battle is the responsibility of Maduro. If we had democratic elections, if we had a normal system, we will not be in this situation. We will have a normal country. And that's what I think all of us want.
There has been allegation of the Maduro government recycling money or being related to narcotraffic cartels. Do you think this is backed up by evidence or is more speculation?
It's backed up by, for example, evidence coming from, let's say, a lot of institutions have labeled Maduro and have accused Maduro and have confirmed Maduro as having this connection with drug dealing. So, for example, since 2020, the Department of Justice in the US have formally declared the Maduro regime is part of a drug dealing operation. Yes. So because of this, then there is this kind of allegations. And based on insights, based on reports, based on think tanks in Washington and in Venezuela, there is a lot of evidence to say that.
Yeah, that's crazy. Like so in the end, always the truth. I mean, it is a bit in the middle, you know. Like because I think like in the debate, is the U.S. is striking on narcotraffic, but this is all a lie because they just want a geopolitical interest, or on the others, and they say, okay, it's just narcotraffic, but often maybe it's really both things. It's really that like the Venezuela current government is related to narcotraffic, and the U.S. have an interest on the oil reserves.
I think it's both. And I think is oil, and I also think that is, I think that it's also foreign powers, like the fact that Venezuela has close allies with Iran, with China, with these kind of states. Is not good for the region. Yeah. So I think it's a combination of all, to be honest.
Yeah. Can I ask you just one last thing on this, and then I stop? Like on this drugs money, and like, do you think in authoritarian regimes there is really a lot of push of drug and illicit crime money to the political governments and elite? For example, in Russia, there are several allegations of the Putin regime being very close to criminal networks that really also put a lot of funds.
I mean, and it makes sense, yes. It's a natural thing for the development of these regimes because, for example, Venezuela used to be 100%, or most of the Venezuelan government budget used to come from oil. If oil revenues goes down, they need to find alternative sources of income. These people, they don't know how to build factories. These people, they don't know how to build long-term investments, but they have connections. So they start doing this kind of black market operations. So in Venezuela, we saw in the last years an increase in illegal mining activities. Again, according to these reports, an increase in drug trafficking operations. And then what happens is that these states become more and more prone to do these kind of shady business deals to keep in power.
Have you been to Venezuela lately?
No, I haven't been to Venezuela since 4 years.
Okay, would you like to go back again soon, or at the moment it's difficult?
I would love to go, but I think there will need to be a change in government for me to go. But if there's a change in government, I will be there, yeah.
Well, that's we wish for you to be back to Venezuela, because I mean it's always a difficult feeling to be away from your hometown, no?
Yes.
Like
and Venezuela used to be a very nice country. Yeah. Venezuela used to be a very nice country for migrants. Both of my grandparents are migrants. One from Italy.
Abruzzo. Nice. Abruzzo. It's a bit a classic.
No, but
it's a bit a classic of
yes.
like, yeah.
One from Abruzzo. My other grandparents from Lebanon. And in general, at the time in Venezuela, we used to be a small country, and we received, I believe, 1 million from Italians, Portuguese, Spaniards, and we welcomed them with open arms. And Venezuela was a combination of different cultures. There was never any kind of conflict. Yeah. There was never tensions. Everybody assimilated very well. the Venezuelans with the Europeans with the Venezuelans. We used to be a nation that grew economically a lot. So from 1920 to 1980, we grew by 6.4% per year. Per year. Wow. Was the highest GDP growth of any country in that period. Oil grew exponentially. So we grew from being a marginal agricultural economy. We passed being the second largest oil exporter at the time. Around the 1950s, we became that. We have huge manufacture. Our GDP per capita in the 1970s was 2.5 times the average in Latin America. Our credit rating was a AAA credit rating. It was a very good country. Then we had 2 decades, 80s and 90s, of stagnation, I would say. Not decay, stagnation. And then people's expectations were not matching the reality. And when that happens, then you have these revolutionary processes in which people just want a change. Doesn't matter if the change is left wing, right wing, really doesn't matter. People just want something different. And that's what happened in Venezuela, and sadly it went for the bad direction. But I think really Venezuela is a country with a lot of opportunities if we have a good government.
Jorge, we always stop with one last question. Since the podcast is called Moving Europe, we're always interested in the guest's opinion on how to move Europe forward in the right direction. So in your view about the 2 aspects we discussed today, so one is really focused on Venezuela and on the other, the economic inclusion aspect. Where do you think in which direction should Europe move, both in its relations with Venezuela, but also to improve access to financial services in the EU?
Yes. I would say, I was thinking about this while you were asking the question, which is that to move Europe forward, I really think that there has to be a consensus between the policy elites, the business elites, and the young people around economic growth and around economic opportunities. I really feel that it's unacceptable, the economic conditions that most people have in Europe. And I think that if we don't change that, there will be serious economic consequences and serious political consequences. Because if people cannot get married, if they cannot have children, if they cannot build a family, if they cannot invest, if they cannot open businesses, they will stop believing in democracy at the same time. So that from one perspective. From the financial perspective, if we don't fix the banking regulations and anti-money laundering laws in Europe, there will be a point in which European banks will be so non-competitive that they will not be able to support any kind of investment flows. They will not be able to support especially investment on energy and defense, which are key for this strategic autonomy and this competitiveness agenda. And when it comes to Venezuela, if Venezuela is free again and is democratic again, Europe will be one of the most important allies. Europe and Venezuela, we share so much culturally, linguistically. We share also religion. We share democratic ideas. That if Venezuela is a democracy again, Europe, and as a result, European institutions, European policymakers, and European companies, I think will be at the center of this transformation in Venezuela.
Yeah, wow, that's a very good closure, and also that you have Italian roots. It's added value. So thanks a lot, Jorge, and thanks to the listeners as well.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Thank you, guys.